So, Prof, at this stage, what do we know about Omicron and its transmissibility and its severity?
So based on experience in South Africa, which was very much mirrored throughout the world, there's clear indication that Omicron is much more transmissible than any other variant that we've experienced in the past. In fact, it's probably at least 2 to 3 times more transmissible than the Delta variant, which infected many, many people. So what we've got is a variant that is probably as infectious as measles virus, if not more infectious. And what we saw in South Africa was a very rapid increase in the number of cases, and then at the same time we saw a very rapid decline. The total period of time during which this wave transpired in South Africa is roughly about 8 weeks, compared to anything between 14 to 16 weeks for the earlier variants. And part of the reason for that is because it seems to have infected many, many people over a shorter period of time. But in addition to that, there's also extensive underlying immunity across the country, which is probably bringing about a very different cause of this particular wave compared to earlier variants when a lower percentage of the population had developed some level of immunity. And that immunity probably also impacts on the transmission of the virus.
Is there a subvariant of Omicron or at the moment that we know of?
Yeah, so there is a subvariant. It's known as a BA2 variant or lineage of Omicron. And it is fairly similar, and I wouldn't be too concerned about it. There's some suggestion that it might be even more transmissible than the Omicron itself, the initial variant. But I wouldn't be too concerned about it, because what's really important is not about people getting infected any longer. I think we've developed some level of comfort that unfortunately people are going to continue getting infected, even beyond the Omicron wave. What's more important is whether it's able to evade the immune system any differently compared with Omicron. And the short answer to that is currently there's no evidence that it works any different to Omicron in terms of being able to evade the immune system.
When we look at the transmissibility rates of Omicron, are they the same between people that are vaccinated and unvaccinated? What do we know about that?
So what we experience is that irrespective of whether people were vaccinated or people had been previously infected with the virus, they actually had a very high number of infections. So we had large numbers of breakthrough infections in individuals that were vaccinated, including people that received 2 doses of vaccine, even more so probably in people that only receive a single dose of vaccine. And people that have been previously infected, they also experience reinfections in large numbers. Now, what does it tell us? It tells us that Omicron has been able to evade that arm of the immune system which protects people from being infected. And I think that was quite permissive across the globe. In a country such as Israel, as well as the United Kingdom, where they gave a 3rd dose of vaccine, a Pfizer vaccine as an example, they were able to show is that the 3rd dose of vaccine, at least for a period of time, was able to enhance protection against infection. But that really shouldn't be our focus. It's no longer about protecting against infection. It's really about protecting against severe disease and death. Now, when people are infected with the virus and have been previously vaccinated, they can still transmit the virus, but probably less than someone that is unvaccinated and has also not been infected with the virus. The best type of protection that exists in terms of being protected from being infected, as well as reducing your chances of transmitting the virus, unfortunately now happens to be a combination of infection plus vaccination. So this hybrid immunity seems to confer some sort of advantage when it comes to making individuals less infectious, less able to transmit the virus. Another vaccine approach, which also works really well in terms of heightening protection against infection and probably also reducing the transmission of the virus, is what is known as a heterologous approach, where we have 2 different vaccines, as an example, the Johnson & Johnson and the Pfizer vaccine given to the same individual. That sort of approach seems to actually enhance protection, even against infection, over and above how well all vaccines work in protecting against severe disease.
Initially, when this all started and there was, this outrage and difference of opinion around the issue of being vaccinated, people thought if I get vaccinated, I'd be immune from the disease, just like when you get a measles jab. Now, that's not the case. We're seeing vaccination now fulfilling a totally different role. And what role is that? And maybe can we expand on how it's actually helping people?
I think we need to just step back. Historically, we've never ever developed a vaccine to prevent infections, even for measles. We don't develop vaccines to prevent infection with measles. The measles vaccine does that very well. But the main reason for vaccinating against measles is to prevent children from ending up in hospital and dying in large numbers. And the same thing goes for every other vaccine we've ever developed. There's not a single vaccine in my past 27 years of working in the field that has been developed to prevent infections. When it does prevent infections, that is a welcome bonus and is a boost. Because when vaccines start preventing infections, in addition to the direct impact that the vaccine has, it also has got an indirect impact in that it prevents rapid spread of the organism that you're targeting. So with COVID-19, I think we somewhat got carried away after the initial study results came out. When these manufacturers companies went into clinical trials, no one expected vaccines to have effectiveness of above 95% against infection. In fact, the regulatory authorities were saying that if your vaccine has got even 50% protection against infection, we will license your vaccine. That was the bar the regulatory authorities were setting. With the initial vaccines that were developed by Moderna, by Pfizer, they showed protection of 94-95% against infection, which is tremendous. But these vaccines, remember, have been developed against a specific variant or the original virus that was circulating. Now, there was no telling that this virus was going to mutate and become what we refer to as antibody evasive. And this antibody is really important when it comes to protecting against infection, not severe disease, but especially against infection. So what happened over time, the virus continued mutating. It became a sort of, these mutations made it relatively resistant to the antibody that was being induced by the vaccines, but also the antibody that was being induced by past infections from previous variants or from the initial wild-type virus. So as an example, in South Africa, when we experienced the beta variant in November, December of 2020, essentially what we showed in South Africa is that people that were initially infected with ancestry virus, they had absolutely no protection from infection against from the beta variant. But at the same time, those people that were infected with ancestry virus, they had protection against severe disease against the beta variant. And the same thing was the case for the AstraZeneca vaccine. The vaccine didn't protect against infection due to the beta variant, although that vaccine protected very well against infection due to the original virus. But the AstraZeneca vaccine then went on to protect very well against severe disease. So yes, maybe we just got carried away with the tide in a sense when these vaccines initial reports came out, high vaccine effectiveness, which means if those vaccines were able to persist with protection of 90-95% against infection, irrespective of what variants arise, then we could have been speaking about herd immunity. But more than a year ago, when we released the South African data, at that stage I already said we need to recalibrate our expectations of vaccines because it was clear that the experience with AstraZeneca vaccine and the beta variant indicated that these vaccines were not the right type of tools to have sustained protection against infection, both because of the waning of antibody as well as because of these mutations that arise.
We find that a lot of South Africans now almost getting to a point of apathy, especially around Omicron. Is that the right attitude, or are we taking chances?
Well, I can understand why people have become more complacent. It's been a long journey. The past 2 years, for me, it seems like 2 months, but for most South Africans, it seems like 20 years in terms of the impact that it has had on them. And I can understand people becoming complacent, but we're fortunate in that we've got extensive immunity, but it has come at massive cost in South Africa. Right now, it's come at a cost of loss of 290,000 lives that are attributable to COVID-19. South Africa ranks amongst the top 10 countries with the highest mortality rate per capita per 100,000. We're sitting right now at about 490 per 100,000 compared to the United Kingdom, which is 220 per 100,000. So what has happened is that across the first 3 waves, even before Omicron arrived, 70% of people in South Africa, and especially in Gauteng, where we did a serious survey just before the onset of Omicron, had been infected at least once since the start of the pandemic. And after Omicron, that figure probably now sits at 85%. So what has happened is that we've reached the threshold that government has been talking about, getting 70% of the population vaccinated. We've reached the threshold of 70% and greater immunity against severe disease and death. Because of a combination of vaccines and unfortunately because of the high force of past infection. So now that people are not seeing as many people end up in hospital that they know, they're not seeing people dying in the large numbers that we experienced during the course of the Delta variant wave, it's unsurprising that people are becoming more complacent and relaxing their guard. And I think that's reason enough to allow for that sort of latitude. We can't continue operating on code red when we're really not no longer in a code red scenario.
Do you still recommend vaccinations across the board?
Absolutely, and especially for adults, and more so for adults above the age of 15.
Why?
So what we've basically seen with the recent data is that natural infection protects against severe disease. It works probably as well as 2 doses of vaccine in someone that hasn't been previously infected. So I think the data is fairly clear on that part of it. But at the same time, when we see who ends up in hospital, it's unvaccinated people. We was ending up dying. 85% of people that are ending up in hospital that are dying in South Africa are unvaccinated or inadequately vaccinated, which is a problem. Now, in addition to that, what we've seen from the recent data is that, like I mentioned earlier, the combination of vaccines and infection, which in either order, actually induces a much more robust immune response, both in terms of this antibody that protects against infection, as well as what we refer to as T-cell immunity, which is what really prevents the progression of infection to severe disease, and also assists in terms of more rapid clearing of the virus. So if we are wanting to sort of have much more attenuated resurgences moving forward, we still need to continue our efforts to try to reduce the amount of people that will be infectious, even if they're infected, right? And the best way to do that is really for people to be vaccinated. And in South Africa, it's just unfortunate. This vaccination is taking place together with a high force of infection. The positive part of it is that the type of immunity that is induced under that scenario is what we would refer to as super immunity. It's hybrid immunity, super immunity, and really works tremendously well. But again, I'm not saying that people should willingly go out to be infected. We need to be clear about that. It's happened. We need to deal with it, live with it, but now we need to leverage on that.
Prof, you still have many people that fear the detrimental side effects of being vaccinated. Are these fears ungrounded? Because it's people's reality.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think what people don't really appreciate is that most adults have received probably about 30, if not more, doses of different vaccines by the time they're even 3 or 4 years of age. And they haven't had long-term sequelae. And the reason for that is when you have side effects from vaccines, those side effects usually manifest within a space of 1 to 3 weeks, and very rarely, maybe 3 months later, very rarely. It's extremely, I don't know of any vaccine where the side effects are manifesting a year after vaccination. So I hear the concern, but at the same time, just in terms of the biology behind it, you're not going to have this sort of long-term side effects, which is often claimed will occur. And you're not going to have large numbers of people die because they were vaccinated in the past year. 10 billion doses of vaccine have been deployed throughout the world. 10 billion doses of vaccine. That's more doses of vaccine than the number of people that live on planet Earth. Okay, we haven't seen a dramatic decline in the population on planet Earth, and we're not going to see that because of vaccines in the next year or in the next 10 years.
Well, people have been locked indoors. You might see a population increase.
There you go. Well, I don't think it's going to measure up to the 10 billion doses. Yeah, so look, and I think at the end of the day, there are some side effects, and there are some fatal side effects, right? But the magnitude of that is in the region of maybe, say, perhaps one in out of every 250,000, 4 in a million, right? At the worst case scenario. Now, if you compare the chances of being struck by lightning in South Africa and dying of a lightning strike, you've got a greater risk of dying in South Africa because of a lightning strike than actually dying because of being vaccinated. So how many people do we know that have been struck by lightning that have died? You don't know any. I don't know any. But those are the stats.
Yes. Prof, another very interesting thing, and if you look at somebody that's been vaccinated and somebody that has been that's not vaccinated, so it's the unvaccinated and the vaccinated here, they still transmit the virus at the same rate. Now, does this mean then when a person goes into a work environment, me that's been vaccinated or somebody that's unvaccinated still pose the same risk to other staff members within an organization? Or how would we then try and then balance those out? Because it's becoming a huge issue in the workplace.
Well, a vaccinated and an unvaccinated person do not have the same chances of transmitting the virus. They might both have the same sort of a high viral load at the initial stage of being infected to the virus.
Yes.
What would happen is that the viral load will actually decline much more rapidly, and they'll shed the live virus for a shorter period of time.
Yes.
So over time, they're actually less infectious than an unvaccinated individual, especially an unvaccinated individual that hasn't been previously infected with the virus. So vaccines itself does reduce infectiousness, even against Omicron. it actually reduces infectiousness. It might still allow for breakthrough infections, but those people, once they get a breakthrough infection, their immune system is better able to contain the replication of the virus, and consequently they're less infectious, they're less able to transmit. But again, it goes back to the same issue which we just mentioned now about the need for ongoing efforts at vaccination. If we have people that have been infected that are now vaccinated, they probably would be less infectious than someone that hasn't been infected but has received 2 doses of vaccine. Right? So I think we're missing an opportunity. It's not about preventing infections, but it's at the same time it's about trying to reduce as much as we can and as best as we can the amount of people that are infectious that are going to transmit the virus in their workspaces. And this becomes especially important when people on a regular basis are going to be gathering indoors. So yes, unvaccinated people that have been previously infected, probably 80% of South Africans that haven't been vaccinated have been previously infected. They've got immunity, they've got protection against severe disease, but we can do better. We can enhance the protection in terms of protecting them as individuals from being infected with the virus, and reduces the chances of them transmitting the virus should they become infected if they are vaccinated.
Prof, would you recommend mandatory vaccinations within the workplace?
Absolutely. I still think there's a strong case to be made for mandated vaccination, especially in workplaces where a large number of people are gathering regularly indoors. And the reason for that is what we've seen with the data, with the science, is that people that are vaccinated, firstly, they are less likely to be infected and they're less likely to transmit the virus. Even with Omicron, people that are vaccinated, they shed the live virus for a shorter period of time, which means that even though they might start off with as high a viral load as an unvaccinated individual that wasn't previously infected, the duration of time that they would be infectious would probably be less than an unvaccinated individual.
Yes.
But in South Africa, as I mentioned, we can't get away from the reality that 80% of people have probably been infected with the virus and they've developed immunity. But that immunity specifically, especially works well against severe disease and death. Now, as I mentioned, the type of immunity that's induced when you have vaccines plus infection in either order, you have a type of immunity that actually enhances your protection against severe disease and probably protects you actually very well against infection, and probably makes you even less infectious if you are infected with the virus. It might not protect you from being infected with the virus, but it will reduce the chances of you transmitting the virus to other people. Now, why is that important?
Yes.
So take a workspace environment. We've got a 60-year-old person, right, who's done the responsible thing, has taken 3 doses of vaccine. He's unfortunately immunocompromised because of some medical condition. Unfortunately, he still remains at risk. He still might have 80% protection against severe disease, but he's still got some risk of developing severe disease if he's infected.
Yes.
We need to do everything that's possible in that work environment to ensure the safety of everyone in that work environment, rather than just prioritizing the preferences of a single individual. And the way to ensure the safety of everyone in the environment as best as we can is to get everyone vaccinated, because even the one person that has been infected that remains unvaccinated is more infectious than that person that was infected that has received the vaccine, and more likely to transmit the virus to that unfortunate responsible individual that did the right thing, took the 3 doses of vaccine that's required, but yet remains susceptible to being infected and to developing severe disease. So it's really from the perspective that vaccines do reduce infectiousness and transmission of the virus, even with Omicron. And especially when those vaccines are given to people that have been previously infected, or where you have the type of combination vaccines where you're mixing vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, another good example, works much better than 2 doses of the Johnson & Johnson or 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine.
So you've got case studies, for example, where a country like Denmark has said that they've dropped all of their COVID restrictions. They no longer consider COVID-19 a socially critical disease. Now, this means that, number one, mandatory vaccinations are dropped. What do we make of this, and will we ever get to that place in South Africa?
We're pretty much in that space already, not with regard to mandated vaccination, and I'm not too sure whether Denmark has said mandated vaccination is completely off the table. It might have well have said it, I'm not too sure about that. And especially for certain sort of populations. At the population level, I think there's no country that's going to, and there are a few countries that are putting a penalty, like Austria and even Australia. They'll put a penalty on individuals that have not been vaccinated. But I think the important message here is that if we are talking of what is a crisis in South Africa, we need to look at it in relation to other sort of challenges that we face. What are the challenges that we face? This year alone in South Africa, unfortunately, and this has been ongoing for almost a decade, 58,000 people will die of tuberculosis. The chances of COVID-19, and there will be further resurgences in South Africa, there probably will be another variant, but the chances of COVID-19 causing 58,000 deaths in the course of the next 12 months is extremely low. It's unlikely the number of people that will die of COVID-19 moving forward and with the next resurgence will be less than what we see in the Omicron wave, which itself was 1/10 of what was experienced with the Delta variant wave, the third wave. So the Omicron wave in South Africa probably contributes roughly to about 5% of all of the COVID-19 deaths that has occurred since the start of the pandemic. The Delta variant wave contributed to 50% of all of the deaths. Moving forward, unless something substantially different happens with this virus, in which case we're probably back to square one, and it's actually unlikely that the virus is going to be able to undergo those sort of mutations that makes it resistant to protection against severe disease that's induced by past infection as well as vaccines. That is an extremely unlikely scenario. So I don't think we've got much choice in this. We pretty much need to start loosening the rope in terms of controls. We've accepted to a large, and government seems to have accepted to a large extent that it's no longer about preventing infections. And that's the reason the manner in which it dealt with the Omicron wave is substantially different to the manner it dealt with earlier waves. It didn't reflexively go into higher levels of restriction, despite some scientists ringing alarm bells that this is like really going to be a major devastating wave, which didn't transpire. So I think government is basically aligning, but it needs to go further and drop whatever remaining restrictions that exist, and especially restrictions when it comes to outdoor gatherings, which have got absolutely no role in lowering the amount of infection that's taking place.
Something quite interesting here is that in 2021, around March, when there was a report that came through about the AstraZeneca vaccines, they said South Africa concluded the sale of AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccines it had acquired, but it did not use them to other African Union member states. Now, the Health Ministry revealed that the country has paused AstraZeneca vaccinations last month because of a small trial showing the shot offered minimal protection against mild to moderate illnesses caused by the dominant local coronavirus variant. Now, we sold 1 million doses of this vaccine and they had diminished efficacy, which is obviously something that is a bit of a concern. But now we're saying that we must have mandatory vaccinations in workplaces, yet this vaccine has a very similar profile. How do we then now go about?
Well, having been the lead investigator on AstraZeneca vaccine trial with all of the biases, and I'm sure you must have heard me speak about it, that yes. For me, when it comes to vaccines, other than South Africa having delayed entering into bilaterals, that was a massive blunder. Of huge proportions.
I remember having this conversation.
Of huge proportions. I mean, let us be clear. The AstraZeneca vaccine didn't prevent against infection and mild disease due to the beta variant. It had greater than 80% protection against severe disease due to the beta variant. And as it happened, had we used that 1 million doses at the time of when the beta variant was circulating, the next variant that came along was the Delta variant. And the AstraZeneca vaccine against infection had 70% effectiveness against the Delta variant and 90% protection against severe disease due to the Delta variant. Had we used at 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, we could have avoided loss of 10 to 15,000 lives in South Africa in people above the age of 50. Yet people above the age of 50 just received a single dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. That is the magnitude of this blunder, the loss of 10 to 15,000 lives. Right? So what you're saying is what we know about these vaccines were designed and constructed against the original virus, right? And they worked very well against the original virus. They again worked well against the Alpha variant. They worked well against the Delta variant. They worked poorly against the Beta variant and the Omicron variant in preventing infections. But preventing infections is not the same as how well vaccines work in protecting against severe disease. Across all of these variants, these vaccines have worked extremely well in protecting against severe disease. In some individuals, especially people above the age of 50, 2 vaccines have been inadequate. You might need a third dose of vaccine to keep high levels of protection against severe disease. But in addition to that, like I said, vaccinated individuals compared with unvaccinated individuals that weren't previously infected, the type of immune responses that are induced by the vaccine might not protect them too well against infection due to Omicron, but still reduces their infectiousness. They're less likely to transmit the virus than someone that is unvaccinated and hasn't been previously infected. And the same thing applies for AstraZeneca vaccine, and the same thing applies for most of these vaccines. So I think we just need to remember that we are going to experience further variants, and there's no second guessing as to where the next variant. Remember, we went from Beta variant, which was relatively antibody evasive, to the Delta variant, which vaccines worked very well, the antibody worked very well against. Then we went to the Omicron variant, which again was even more antibody evasive than a Beta variant. What is the next variant going to look like? We don't know. And it might well be the next variant is similar to the Delta variant, which vaccines, again, start protecting even against infection to allow us to benefit the most when there is another variant. And if the next variant is one that is less antibody evasive, then again, vaccination is going to play a big role in reducing the amount of infections that take place and protecting people, both directly as well as indirectly.